Hi everyone, it's Amanda Forbes from Children's Health Defence Canada, and today I have something very important to discuss with you all. How many of you out there are astonished to see the rapid decline of the morals and ethics in our once beautiful and free country, not only here in Canada, but to our neighbors in the US as well? When is enough going to be enough? Well, today I wanted to bring you yet another attempt by our government and our health ministers to change our health standards at the expense of we the people, which after the last 3 years should be of no shock. But this time it's going to be up to us to shine a light on it in order to protect ourselves and take action. We are responsible for the people at this point as a whole, as a collective, and around the world. And as sad as it is that it's come to be this way, we are forced into the position of becoming the government watchdogs, and we've been left no other options. So today we're going to shine a light on a 2019 Advanced Therapeutics Products pathway, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, or the ATP for short, an industry-devised backdoor that is making its appearance once again in this country, and we aren't being told about it. This is yet another attempt of Big Pharma to come in and rewrite the very regulations that were originally put in place to protect us from their abuse and corruption. That's like telling a car thief your keys are in the ignition and walking away. It's ridiculous. Are you seeing the conflicts yet? But today I'm going to introduce you to two very special guests of mine from the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, Judy Stinson and Deanna McLeod, who are here to tell us a little bit more about the Agile licensing amendments to our Food and Drug Act and why it should be such a concern to each and every single Canadian across this country. So I'm going to bring them in and let them introduce themselves to you. I'm so excited to have you ladies here. Thank you so much for having such a beautiful heart and caring for everyone across this country. Where do we start? Deanna, maybe you can introduce yourself before we get into all the nitty gritty.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. So my name's Deanna McLeod, and I'm the principal of a medical research firm called Kaleidoscope Strategic. So I represent a group of scientists and clinicians who the focus of our firm is really to develop evidence-based guidelines in cancer. So we're the kind of people who are always in the data. We're analyzing things. We're watching regulatory policy. We understand the level of evidence needed to move things forward. We understand when something is safe, and we understand when something's effective, and we know our job is really to raise the alarm bell if we see anything that's outside of that space. And so I'm coming today to talk about these agile, I'm just going to loose quotes, regulations, or the deregulation of our regulatory system, and how concerning that is for me, just from what I understand of cancer research and drug development, and also a Big Pharma. So I'm hoping to be able to share a lot of that with you today. We've done a deep dive into this particular area recently, and I think there's some things that people need to know.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Judy?
Yeah, we're so lucky to have Deanna. So Amanda, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here. I joined the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. I think they were interested in my journalism background. I worked for almost a decade at CBC National TV News back in the 90s. And when they brought me on, we were just trying to get word out about, early treatment. And then we had to sort of shift our focus to the vaccines. But, we were in an echo chamber. There was no getting anything out at all because nobody wanted to debate and nobody wanted to know the full story. And so here we are today looking at legislation. And I think it's really important, for me as a journalist to sort of paint a historical picture of what is going on. And this is a process that started, the policy and legislation back in 2019. And at the time, the industry minister was Yves Duclos, and this You referred to it as a bypass. It's the ATP pathway, is what they called it in the legislation. And this was brought in to assist Big Pharma in getting what they refer to as novel therapies approved. And, I'll let Deanna expand upon this, but, the idea is that if you've got something of benefit that's going to benefit patients, you want to get it to them as soon as possible. And that's a valid, but the biggest concern for from where we stand is that these products must be safe. They're not of benefit if they create more harm than they do good. And the only way to determine that, and Deanna can expand on this, is through very, very serious, structured control trials called RCTs, randomized controlled trials. And so that's our main concern. Fast forward to today, so 2019, this was put in place. Fast forward to today, that same minister working with, industry types is now our health minister. And there are amendments being put forward to bring these products. And, I'll just read off from my list here. These are some, but not all, of the products that they are proposing would fall under this umbrella: gene and cell therapy, nanotechnology, digital health products, and AI, artificial intelligence. So, I'll let Deanna sort of talk a little bit more to that, but biologics are part of this, and that is deeply concerning to us.
Yeah, and we know biologics have always been a big part of that push. Now, are you referring? Is this just for humans, or is this a grand scope?
No, yeah, this would apply to veterinary medicine as well, and of course that there's a domino effect in terms of our food system. So this is deeply concerning to us.
Yeah. Okay, ladies. Well, I'm going to just let it go. Deanna, you tell us everything you know in that big, brilliant, beautiful brain of yours.
Oh
Let's let the
my, I
Canadians
don't know.
know what's going on.
Yeah, well, again, Amanda, I'm not a regulatory specialist, but I do deal in evidence all the time, and I'm very familiar with the levels of proof that you need in order to be able to authorize something and ensure that it's safe. And I think that Judy mentioned that before. And one of the things our medical system does is that we have 3 tests. You have to prove that it's safe, you have to prove that it's effective, and usually you can't actually prove that unless you're comparing it to something else. So ideally a standard of care, that's something clinically relevant. And then you have to prove that the benefits outweigh the risk, that you're not causing more harm than you are good. And that's what's allowed us to have such confidence in our health system, is this idea that there is a test, or there are tests that are in place that make sure that things that are harmful are not pushed on the market, because we know that pharmaceutical companies basically profit from the sale of their medications and drugs and products and medical devices. And therefore, there's a really big temptation to be able to perhaps enhance the benefits or exaggerate the benefits and minimize the risk. And so that's why we have a regulatory agency. It's somebody, it's a government agency that has the fiduciary responsibility of ensuring that no harmful products get on the market. And so that whenever we are receiving something, that we know that it is the right medication for the right condition, and that if it is harmful, or if there does have a risk profile, that's well characterized, meaning we know a lot about it before we start giving it to people. And that's really important as well for informed choice. If you're going to be able to say, if you're given the option of a treatment and you want to basically say, for my particular condition, and for instance, I deal a lot with advanced cancer, I might be willing to take a drug that has a higher risk profile, that might cause some adverse events in order to get the benefit of shrinking and maybe disappearing my tumor. And so that's a valid option for some people who have late stage disease. And so I think it's completely appropriate that we allow them, excuse me, and that we allow them to make those choices. And so there's a couple things that need to happen. And the standard in Canada is that you test extensively. And then once something has been tested, then you can basically say that you've proven that it's safe. But proving that it's safe, or even proving that it's effective, is extremely costly, because these randomized controlled trials, including all the trials that lead up to it, like phase 1 and 2 clinical trials and all the preclinical research, is very expensive. It's one of the greatest line items in terms of cost from a pharmaceutical company. So there could very well be a very strong motivation to try and lower that standard so they get access to the market earlier, and also lower that standard so they don't actually have to invest in the research that's required to prove safety. So you could really understand from a business point of view that there is a strong incentive to minimize the burden of proof that you need to produce in order to be able to be declared safe. And so one of the things that a lot of Canadians aren't really aware of is that over the last 10 years, especially, a lot of companies have moved from working in a national space through technology and through the fact that we, can communicate so effortlessly across the world. What we have now is really these global companies that work across multiple nations, and they basically organize and devise plans and strategies that are then implemented and rolled out into multiple countries simultaneously. And so a lot of our regulatory system really doesn't have a lot of it's based on trials it was traditionally based on trials being done locally. And it doesn't really have an eye for any of the types of conflicts of interest or the changes that are happening at a global level. And interestingly enough, Judy was mentioning that the ATP, the Advanced Therapeutics Product Pathway, or the framework, was put in place, was pushed through legislation. And in fact, that wasn't done in a bubble. What that was something that it was initiated in 2016. And believe it or not, it was initiated through the Advanced Council for Economic Growth. So it really wasn't even a medical thing whatsoever, but the part of the government that launched this kind of think tank or roundtable about how to grow the economy. And I believe what happened, when we're tracing through some of the literature, is they basically said, what we want to do is we want to attract the eye and the investment of these global companies, and we want them to invest in Canada. And so what happened was that the government went from something that was there to protect the people to all of a sudden something that was there to grow the Canadian economy, which from a government standpoint isn't terrible. But what they did is that they then took it upon themselves to partner with industry in order to be able to figure out ways to incentivize global companies to bring jobs to Canada. And so that is a conflict of interest at the greatest level. And it's really striking, because what we usually think is that our government there is to keep us safe. But here, the government is then taking on the side of industry and looking to actually advance profits of the pharmaceutical companies so that they'll invest in Canada. So there's a whole other interest at play that Canadians really need to be aware of. Anyways, fast forward, there was a health and biosciences economic table that was formed. That was just at the end of 2017. And they published a report in 2018. And basically, surprisingly enough, the report said what we need to do is we need to minimize the investment that we have to do in proving that these things are safe. That's just too cumbersome. And we want to be able to have some flexibility and some agility, i.e. we don't have to work so hard to get these things to the market. We want to be able to get to the market faster, and we don't really want to be doing as much work to get them there. And so, interestingly enough, the reports are filled with a lot of, marketing jargon, where, of course, you got to put a spin on this, because if you tell Canadians that, you just want to lower the regulatory standards or you want to deregulate, they're going to be saying, how can we be sure that there's no harm that's going to happen? So of course, then they talked about, needing flexibility and needing to support innovation, and we need agility. But really what that is, after having read the reports, in my mind, it's really code for we don't want to work as hard in order to prove safety. And so we want you to lower the safety bar, maybe not right across the board right away, but for the drugs and the devices that we're most interested in pushing, which we call novel technology. And interestingly enough, when we're looking at guidelines and development of guidelines and recommendations, and, traditionally when a regulatory body would be looking at this, we'd say novel tech, novel being defined as, I don't know very much about it. Therefore, a greater need for study in order to properly characterize the safety profile and to be able to figure out who is going to benefit from it and who isn't going to benefit, so that you could give them treatment properly and so that people can make informed choices. And so, as Judy mentioned, in 2019, at the 11th hour, hidden deep in the bowels of an omnibus, Bill C-97, there was a bill passed in Parliament that actually created this little regulatory loophole, or this backdoor, that basically changes the test or the standard needed to basically approve something, and creates this opportunity to have kind of like this list of advanced therapeutic products. And so what that'll do is it'll basically incentivize all the companies to start advocating that their particular product be put on this special list, because this special list has privileges and different tests associated with it. So interestingly enough, the door was opened, and not only did industry help design the door, of course, to help support innovation, but basically they are also participants in figuring out who's going to be on the special list. So for instance, the Health Canada now, instead of basically being somebody who's independent and somebody who's basically holding the bar and making sure that everybody matches it, they're actually going to be going out and consulting with industry and saying who would like to be on the list, and facilitating that, with early collaboration. So it's a real shift in, I think, the mandate that our government's been given our regulatory body, from somebody that is kind of independent, objective, has a framework, they apply it to everybody. There's equal access to, this kind of subjective, arbitrary framework where somebody can kind of make a pitch to be on the list. Whenever we read the guidelines, to my mind, it isn't very strict in terms of who gets to be on there or not. They talk about a lot about, we'll start off like this and maybe we'll add some more, or maybe we won't add some more, and we're going to be really flexible. But that's really concerning. That should be really concerning to Canadians, in my mind, because once you start adding flexibility and a monetary incentive that's that strong, then basically, the standard is just going to erode as the advocacy groups and, these big, large multinational companies start to develop pitches and plans to get through that back door. So I think one of the things that, I really would like the viewers to hear about right now, which I think is really important, is that there's the new test. So the old test used to be that you had to prove safety, you had to prove efficacy through rigorous testing, and then you had to prove that the benefits outweigh the risks. And so that's, the framework that we've approached all of the different recommendations that we've made. But interestingly enough, I just really want you to just pause and listen to the linguistic gymnastics that are at play here. I'm going to read you the new test, which is a part of the amendment. It goes something like this. It goes, there's going to be sufficient evidence, right, to support the conclusion. So now we've moved from proving something in the context of a randomized controlled trial to be able to provide sufficient evidence. We don't know what sufficient is. It doesn't describe what kind of evidence, because there's multiple layers of evidence, and some of it is rigorous, and some you can prove something and others you can't. So, some just, as long as you provide some sort of evidence to support the conclusion, you don't even need to have it prove anything. You just have to support the conclusion that the benefits associated with the product outweigh the risks. And, they don't even describe whether that's at an individual level or maybe it could be a collective level. For instance, the government could say, oh my goodness, there's a public health emergency, and the benefits of giving this drug to everybody outweigh the risks of this drug, causing all sorts of hospitalization. Therefore, from the collective level, I think that we should move forward with this. So we don't even have any specifics in terms of whether it's an individual risk-benefit ratio or a collective risk-benefit ratio. So, personally, what this is doing is it's basically allowing people to present an argument that they think that their drug could be good. And then based on that, hypothesis, that speculative declaration, then they would be able to authorize the product under this special pathway. And that's the test that they actually used for the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines is, there's evidence to prove it. And so, of course, we approved those particular vaccines based on a randomized controlled trial. There was one in healthy people conducted, but it only ran for 2 months. And it only measured disease outcomes, at least for mild disease, their primary endpoint, at 7 days. So it was a point in time analysis. It doesn't tell you whether it was working before that point in time. It doesn't tell you whether it was working after that point in time. So we have no real understanding of the full magnitude of benefit for that particular thing. And of course, it really didn't measure the important things like, did it help reduce hospitalization and death? That was all just speculated based on this 7-day point in time analysis. So I guess what we're saying here then is we really need to be concerned that this new backdoor has been open and that the burden of proof, i.e. the amount of evidence, the amount of research that they need to do in order to be able to get the nod from our regulatory authorities is quite low. And that now our regulatory authorities are in a prime position to be lobbied and badgered and harassed. If they don't actually go and seek the industry out themselves, to further erode the regulatory bar. But I think the one thing that we need to be really aware of, and that people should know that's happening right now, is this, that they're actually proposing further regulatory amendments. So we created this backdoor through that legislative act that passed in 2019. And now there's a list, section Schedule G, that a product can be listed on in order to be able to access this kind of expedited pathway. And when they talk about an expedited pathway, it could be that they get special privileges in adapting the clinical trial design as they did with the COVID-19 vaccines. That was, part of it. But the ones that they're really talking about now are this ability to extend something called a rolling review. And that sounds like a really weird thing, but basically what it is that traditionally companies or manufacturers would have to submit a complete dossier with their final studies, like their best evidence and their most mature data. So I've completed my testing and here's my most mature data, and you evaluate it, and I'm going to make the argument that the benefits outweigh the risk and that it's safe and effective, and then you're going to look at it and you're going to see if you agree with me or not, and that's the role of the regulatory body. But what they're going to do is they're going to basically start looking at the dossier early. So for instance, with the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines, they started looking at the data at 2 months. Usually, if somebody takes a peek at the data before a planned analysis, you basically compromise the study. But it seems as though, they're going to want to start looking at the dossier early. I don't know whether that's looking at toxicology or preclinical data or what level of data now that they're going to start looking at it. And they do argue that they're going to have to make sure that, whatever is approved is proven safe and effective before it's authorized. But now they have a special test that basically just means that you have to have some evidence in play. And you need to make an argument that it's going to be beneficial in order to get approved. So again, there's a lot of concern in terms of subjectivity and arbitrariness and a lack of clarity and transparency and objectivity in terms of exactly what's going to get pushed forward. And if we think about the mRNA vaccines that they pushed through, we know that they were able to collapse what usually takes 10 years of study into 1 year, right? So that's definitely economical for the companies. And that they were then able to get access to the market with data from 2 months based on rolling reviews. And then, basically it was approved potentially with conditions, which they're proposing here, that the minister can improve conditions, that they just basically do extra pharmacovigilance. And so that's a crazy word, and maybe a lot of people don't really know about that one. But what that means is that they just kind of monitor the safety of a drug after it's been put on the market. And so pharmacovigilance is a really important thing, because when you do a clinical trial, you're really only ever studying healthy people. And so that the moment that you start rolling that drug out to people in the general population who have all sorts of other conditions, and and then of course people's makeup is so broad and so different, that you're going to run into some trouble. And so those pharmacovigilance studies were really designed to help us understand, to build on the safety that was obtained in the randomized controlled trials, and help us understand how to tailor that treatment to people. But what seems to be happening, and of course it's not surprising, is that they want to substitute randomized controlled data, or maybe start giving it early, and then they're telling themselves that we'll just do more pharmacovigilance. But one of the things that we know for sure when it comes to pharmacovigilance is that it's just not a very sensitive test for safety. And so you're really not going to pick up the safety signals that you would when you're in a randomized controlled trial. And there's no way that you can characterize it. But I think the worst thing about that is that you could be moving forward with a harmful product, and then now you're monitoring safety by the level of harm that you're inflicting on the population. And a lot of the time, you can't actually give people permission to make an informed choice about that, because you can't actually tell them, because you don't know very much about the safety profile. So a lot of what they're proposing might seem good and well, because they're going to get these new technologies to the market. But what they'll also be doing is they'll be burying any type of safety or harm signals. It'll be making it very, very difficult to figure out what's harming who, and how to prevent it. So those are just some of the things that I think that people need to be aware of. And of course, there's some aspects of these proposed regulations that would extend to use of these novel technologies, as yet undefined, in a preventative capacity, and Judy touched on that. So the reason why you really don't ever want to do novel, especially novel, potentially high-risk tech, and I would put gene editing, gene therapy, and biologics in that category, is because healthy people, when you're dealing in prevention, you're usually giving it to healthy people. And if there is something that is harmful and you give it to somebody who's healthy, then that injury can then shape their whole life. And we talk about quality of life years lost. So you could lose up to 20 quality of life years. If you're a young person, if you're a teenager, up to 70 quality of life years, if you're harmed by one of these novel techs at the beginning. And so some of these proposed amendments are that, if there was, and this is interesting, not even an emergency anymore, if there's an emerging infectious disease, and those happen all the time, there's an outbreak of something, then, they'll be able to push a novel tech, through this back door, and they'll be able to justify giving it in the form, say, for instance, of a vaccine or a diagnostic test, without doing all the rigorous study that we normally would do. For instance, these lower standards for proving safety and efficacy, and also being able to get that out to the market earlier, expedited, and maybe replacing some of the rigorous study that we usually do with some, general study, which is what the pharmacovigilance is. And so I think that should be concerning to everybody. And for me, the reason why, I talked to Judy and I raised this, and, I wanted to take the deep dive, was because, in cancer therapy, we know that if you're at the end of your life, you might be willing to risk more in order to get a benefit. And that's something that is your right to choose. However, whenever you're a healthy person and you were given a novel tech, and told that it's safe, and yet it hasn't been properly studied, the risk of harm is very high, and that injury could last a lifetime. And so I would never want anybody to be in a position for that to happen, where their healthy life is lost based on corporate greed, and what it would seem to be complicity on the form of our government in facilitating this type of a thing. And so, it looks like our government isn't going to be the one that's going to stand up to protect ourselves. So I think that that's going to be yours and mine, my role. And there's an opportunity at this point to submit comments on these amendments, and even comments on the ATP, the Advanced Therapeutics Products pathway, and say, what, we disagree. We do not want our health system compromised. We do not want you to be lowering the standards. We want the same high levels of standard. We want to be confident that whatever drug, especially this novel tech that's being put out on the market, is safe. And it will not cause us harm. And I think that if the government continues with this, that they are going to irreparably jeopardize the trust that we have in our medical system. And I think that that would be a game changer. And I think that people really need to wake up and take a look, because things have been dramatically modified while we were sleeping. While we were locked down in our houses, somebody was working heavily in the back room to change the rules of the game, so that when we emerged, we'd be in a different playing field. So, Amanda, thanks for just giving me a few minutes to chat about this kind of things. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yes, I absolutely do, and I can see Judy has some stuff to add. So I'm just, what. All as you're speaking, all I can see is this entire 3 years that has taken place. They're just taking that and fitting it over the rest of our lives. So we're compromising safety for money yet again. And the government isn't working for us, period. They're working for their buddies in pharma or big ag or big tech or big whatever at this point, right? The people have now taken a back seat, and it's time for the people to step forward. What is our time frame to do something about this?
We don't have a lot of time, Amanda. In Canada, the date is set for reply to this through the Canada Gazette, or to, I think his name is Bruno Rodriguez. I don't have the notes right in front of me. Oh, look at you. You're all organized.
I can't put the address in. It's too big. So we'll post that with the show.
Yes. And I'll tell you, to help Canadians with this, we will, the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, and that's CanadianCOVIDCareAlliance.org, will have information in a newsletter coming out today, along with a sample letter. So that'll be something that can help Canadians reply by this deadline of April 26th. And I just want to recap, if you're all right with that,
Yes.
Deanna's just, she's all over it, and she just knows so much. But from in the 2 minute and 30 second on the national news, here's basically what I would like people to know. So I'm also a holistic nutritionist, and there's nothing in my mind more important when it comes to the health and safety, well-being of Canadians than the precautionary principle. And that just simply means you prove something to be safe. You don't wait, and because if you don't prove that it's safe, you're proving that it's harmful. And that's darn near impossible to do. It's not totally impossible, but it's very, very difficult to do. And in my discussions with Deanna, she knows the industry much, much better than I do, especially the oncology sector. But if you let industry in before you have proven safety, you're faced with the prospects of proving harm. And in order to do that, you would need to set up randomized controlled trials. Now, isn't that ironic that we don't demand on the front end that be done, but that's what we would demand in order to prove harm at the back end? Because if you've got, the argument is always, well, you can't prove that's what caused it. So causality is not, causality and correlation, they're not the same thing. That is what we hear. Well, this person died or this person's injured. Well, you can't prove it was because of this technology, this biologic. So
Right.
I just want to simply point that out. The other point that Deanna has raised is how involved big pharma, and you've mentioned it as well, is in the policy making and at the at the table with the regulators. There is no place for anybody outside of the regulators at that table, and
It's a conflict.
it's just
extreme conflict.
At the highest level.
And to allow that, and to allow that, and have and be representing your industry buddies is an actual betrayal to Canadians. That I cannot make any more clear, if I tried. So, while there may be a very small, segment of the population who would benefit from being able to, especially in the space that Deanna works in, oncology, right? People that are terminally ill need to get things more quickly, potentially, if they're safe. But by and large, in a healthy population, and that's, prevention and diagnostics, that's just not on. That we say full on, no, prove it's safe first. Because otherwise we're in a situation where, we're left proving harm, and that's near impossible to do.
I think one of the light bulbs that went off for me when I was doing this research is, when I was analyzing all the COVID-19 data, I was thinking people have lost their mind. Like, how are we getting past all of our safeguards that we have in place? And it was only when I started reading this literature that I realized that this has been orchestrated by the government. Like, it's the government that's been organizing and orchestrating these tables, that has, put through this legislation full well knowing. And then it dawned on me that really, we're kind of like, the world as we know it is like an awkward grade 8 dance, where our prime minister is on the, the global stage with all these other countries, and he's a wannabe, and he's willing to do anything to be liked. And, to get attention for Canada. And he thinks that if he does all the right moves, that, the cool crowd's going to turn over and say, hey, Canada, we're going to invest in you. I think that's extremely naive. I think that he's probably, that he's lost in a very significant way, and that he's not, but I think, whatever his motivations, he seems to be working for the attention, investment of this global community, perhaps in the capacity of prime minister, but maybe he's making a career, like he's making his next move, like in terms of a career move. We don't know, but it is an incredible breach of public trust for him to move from an elected official that's supposed to be representing Canadians and working for Canadians, to then shift to begin to work for these global corporations and these global entities, and to sell out Canadian regulation and Canadian safety and Canadian resources and everything else. And so I think as the Canadian people, we basically need to give him a little bit of a wake-up call. That's that last little bit was from me, not a CCCA position, but I do think that we have to keep our government representatives accountable, and clearly they're not working for us in this particular capacity, and we need to make some changes and make sure that they understand that we're the ones that need to be representative, and that our well-being is the greater priority. It's a higher priority than the economy. It's a higher priority than where we stand on a global stage. Compromising each other and selling each other out is not the best way forward. And I think we need to send that message, both, to Bruno Rodriguez, but, should an election come up soon too, I think that that's an important thing to emphasize.
Yeah, and I agree. And I have one more question for you ladies, and because I don't know if it's, I know you brought it up a little bit, but who determines what that casualty threshold is before something gets pulled? Is that even named in these policies, or or are we going to play the COVID game again, where if you're under, 14 days vaccinated, you're not considered vaccinated type thing. So you're not counted. Are we going to play those games?
That's actually a really good point, Amanda, because I mean, with the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines, basically they did 2 months of study and a point in time analysis. So they said 7 days after, do you or do you not test positive for COVID, and do you not have symptoms, right? Like, not even that that's anything clinically relevant, because all of us have sniffles and none of us have, gotten very concerned about it before. But of course, then you test positive, and then, all of a sudden this diagnostic thing. But the beautiful thing about the COVID-19 thing, and I'm thinking of it beautiful in the sense of a pharmaceuticals dream, pharmaceutical company's dream, is that you really want to lower the bar, and you really, if you can, you don't want to play in the randomized controlled trials because those are super hard to gain. But if you can lower the bar and start playing in observational data, how they did these retrospective reviews, and they're like, we did analysis, and those with COVID, those who were vaccinated, did poorly, and those who weren't vaccinated didn't, like all this kind of real world analysis. Those are called observational studies. And the reason why, if you were a pharmaceutical company and you wanted to game your data, you'd want to go into that, is because they're super easy to manipulate. You can just totally manipulate them. You can manipulate them based on what you see and what you compare it to, about who you put in your analysis and who you don't put in your analysis. You can omit factors that are really important, like natural immunity, and which could basically be causing certain outcomes, and you just ignore them altogether. There's all sorts of things that you can do, and they were working over. They were Cirque du Soleil with COVID-19 mRNA vaccines in terms of their gymnastics and data handling. So I mean, hats off to them on that one. But we definitely don't want to be in a position where we allow them to lower that bar, because then they'll be able to make the data say whatever they want the data to say. So not all science is the same science. There's certain science that's basically designed to test a hypothesis and to then move into a randomized controlled trial where you can prove it to be true or not to be true. And then there's some science that you just never rely on in order to make a recommendation, because it's too easily biased, and the outcomes could be from any number of things, and you never really want to move forward with that. And that's really the data that they're proposing that we rely on most heavily, and which I think would be really concerning, because again, as Judy said, then we'll have this data, and we might be able to see some signals of harm, but we'd never be able to prove that it was associated with their drug. So it's beautiful. I mean, it's, there has to be lawyers involved in this. Like, there was some really great thinking from some really great minds in terms of how to, circumvent our system. But what I think they underestimated is the fact that there's great minds on the other side too, and that if we don't stand for it, they can't move forward with any of this. So I think that's kind of where it lands, is that we as individuals really need to raise raise heck and say no is no. We're not accepting it.
Yeah, I completely. Yeah, completely agree. I was just going to say, Amanda, I just want people to know, do not be fooled by language. Novel therapies, agile regulation, ATP pathway. This is basically deregulation, backdoor treatments, and placing people at risk of harm. And there's no end run to be done around proper determination of safety. That safety must be proven. It cannot be declared. And I think, we need to keep our sights on that. That's sort of the bottom line here, the thesis in all of this.
Yeah, and we've seen 3 years of what that can do. So it's up to us. We're the watchdogs now. We are literally the watchdogs, and it's going to take each and every single one of us to hold these people accountable. We put them in place to take care of our needs on a world stage. So now it's up to us to make sure that they do that. And however, what the future holds in that, I don't know, but I am positive as I watch us all come together that it's going to happen in some regards. So thank you, ladies, for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. once we're out of here, just hang on for a couple minutes backstage. But to everybody out there, to allow these amendments to go through would be a complete betrayal of the Canadian people. It would mean working for economic powers rather than the Canadian people. Safety barriers are being lowered intentionally in this case to benefit global corporations. So I want you to ask yourself, who do our elected representatives work for? And let's all reach out. Every voice matters. We're going to change this. Thanks for joining, everybody, and we'll talk to you again soon.